Daughter thought she married a good man. I never corrected her. Not right away. I want to say that first, because everything that comes after is going to sound like I was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. I wasn't. I was just a father trying to figure out how much rope to give a man before he used it on himself. His name was Nathan. Nathan Caulfield. He came from a family that had money the way some families have furniture. Inherited, maintained, never really earned. His father, Bernard Caulfield, had built Caulfield Industrial Supply into one of the larger regional distributors in the Southeast. Sheet metal, PVC fittings, commercial HVAC components. Not glamorous, but solid. The kind of business that prints money quietly while everyone else chases trends. My daughter Ivy met Nathan at a charity golf tournament outside Savannah. She was there with a friend. He was there with his father's credit card and a smile that I later learned he'd been practicing since prep school. She called me that night, excited in a way I hadn't heard in a while, and I told her I was happy for her. I meant it. I just also made a note. I should tell you something about myself that matters here. My name is Leonard Marsh. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years in commercial real estate investment, acquiring, repositioning, and disposing of industrial and mixed-use properties across Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. I retired from active management 6 years ago, or what other people think of as retirement. I still hold interests. I still make calls. I still read every document that comes across my desk, which is a habit I developed early and never broke. I look like someone's grandfather. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150 with a dent in the rear quarter panel I never bothered to fix. I wear the same 3 pairs of khakis I've owned for a decade. When Nathan first met me, I was wearing a flannel shirt and work boots because I'd been helping my neighbor clear brush from his property line that morning. I could see what Nathan thought the moment he shook my hand. It wasn't rude exactly. It was just the look a man gets when he's already decided something isn't worth his full attention. That was fine. I've been underestimated my entire life. I found it useful. Ivy and Nathan were married 14 months after that golf tournament. The wedding was at the Caulfield's property outside Hilton Head. It was beautiful. Bernard gave a toast that was mostly about himself and the Caulfield name, but I've heard worse. I stood in the back near the bar and watched my daughter dance with her new husband, and felt the complicated thing that fathers feel at moments like that. Pride and worry braided together so tight you can't separate them. The first 2 years were fine. Nathan worked at Caulfield Industrial in a vice president role his father had created specifically for him. He and Ivy bought a house in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Nice neighborhood. 4 bedrooms, more than they needed, but less than they wanted. I visited when I could. I took them to dinner. I watched. The thing about Nathan was that he wasn't a bad person in any obvious way. He didn't drink too much. He didn't run around. He worked hard, in his fashion. But there was something underneath all of it that made me careful. A way he had of talking about money. Not about earning it or building something, but about having it. About what it signaled. He said things that sounded like compliments, but were really measurements. He sized people up the way a contractor assesses a building before demo. I started to understand what I was looking at in the 3rd year of their marriage. That summer, Caulfield Industrial acquired a smaller competitor out of Charlotte. The deal was structured partly with debt, partly with new equity. Bernard brought in outside investors to cover the gap. I didn't know this at first. I heard it secondhand from a former colleague who knew someone on the financing side. I didn't think much of it until Nathan mentioned it at Thanksgiving in a way that told me he didn't want me to know the details. I'm old enough to know that when someone doesn't want you to know something, that's usually the most important thing to know. I made some calls. I have a former associate, a man named Theodore, who has spent 40 years doing due diligence on private companies. Theodore is 71, semi-retired, and still sharper than anyone I've ever met in a conference room. I asked him to pull together what he could on Caulfield Industrial's capital structure. He called me back 3 days later. "Len," he said, "this is interesting. The outside equity that came in for the Charlotte acquisition. A portion of it was quietly arranged through a holding company that Nathan had a beneficial interest in. The structure was obscure enough that it wouldn't raise flags in a casual review. But Theodore found it. Nathan had essentially helped arrange financing that paid him a fee he hadn't disclosed to his father or to the board. That was the first thing. The second thing was a property. There was a 16-acre parcel outside Columbia, South Carolina, that Caulfield Industrial had been eyeing as a potential warehouse expansion site. The land was zoned correctly. The location made sense. The company had been in preliminary talks with the seller for about 8 months. Then quietly, the seller shifted. Stopped returning calls from Caulfield's real estate team. The parcel eventually sold to a different buyer. The buyer was another holding company, also obscure, also connected to Nathan. Nathan had bought the land out from under his father's company. The plan, as near as Theodore could determine, was to lease it back to Caulfield Industrial at a premium, or hold it and resell at a markup once the company's need became urgent enough. I sat with that for a while. I want to be clear about what I was weighing. Ivy loved this man. Whatever he was doing in his business life, he was, as far as I could see, a decent husband to my daughter. She was happy. She talked about starting a family. I did not want to be the instrument of her unhappiness if I could avoid it. But I also knew what I was looking at. I was looking at a man who was willing to steal from his own father's company, which meant he was willing to steal from his father, from the employees who depended on that business, and eventually, inevitably, from my daughter when the structure came apart the way those structures always do. I didn't say anything to Nathan. Not yet. I needed to understand the full picture, and I needed something else. I needed to understand my own position relative to all of it. That's when things got complicated in a way I hadn't anticipated. 3 years before Ivy and Nathan's wedding, I had made a quiet investment. Bernard Caulfield had been looking for capital to expand the company's distribution network. He was introduced to me through a mutual acquaintance in Charleston, a man who'd done business with both of us without either of us knowing it. Bernard and I met for lunch, talked for 3 hours, and by the end of it, I had agreed to take a position in Caulfield Industrial, not a large one relative to my overall holdings, but meaningful. I acquired just under 9% of the company's equity at a valuation that turned out, over the following years, to be significantly below what the business was actually worth. When Ivy told me she was seeing Nathan Caulfield, I had a decision to make. I chose not to disclose the investment. Not to Ivy, not to Nathan, not to Bernard. My reasoning was simple. My relationship with my daughter was personal, and my investment in Caulfield Industrial was business. I had done nothing wrong by holding both. But I knew that if I disclosed it, the dynamic of every family interaction going forward would shift in ways I didn't want. I decided to wait for the right moment. The right moment arrived in a way I hadn't scripted. Nathan came to visit me in Augusta on a Friday afternoon in October. He came alone, which was unusual. He was polite, helped himself to coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and told me he had a business opportunity he wanted to discuss with me. He had learned, through channels I still don't fully understand, that I had liquidity. Not the specifics of the Caulfield investment, he didn't know about that, but he'd done enough digging to know I wasn't the retired handyman I appeared to be. Someone had talked. It happens. What Nathan wanted was this. He was planning to consolidate his position in the Columbia land parcel and 2 other properties he quietly acquired, then approach an outside investor to fund the larger real estate play that would ultimately put pressure on Caulfield Industrial's expansion timeline. In plain terms, he wanted to squeeze his father's company until Bernard had no choice but to buy the land at Nathan's price, or bring Nathan in as a more formal partner with a significantly larger equity stake. He wanted me to fund part of it. He didn't say it exactly that way. He dressed it up in language about strategic land banking and logistics infrastructure investment. But I've read enough term sheets to know what someone is asking when they start talking around the edges of a number. I asked him what kind of returns he was projecting. He said 22% over 3 years, conservatively. I said that was interesting. I asked him how the deal was structured. He walked me through it. It was clever. I'll give him that. Complicated enough to obscure, simple enough to execute if you had the right relationships and the right patience. I asked him one more question. I asked him whether his father knew about any of this. Nathan smiled. It was a particular kind of smile. The kind that's meant to signal sophistication, shared understanding, men of the world. He said his father was a great businessman but didn't always see the bigger picture. I told him I'd think about it. He left around 4 o'clock. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and then I sat in my kitchen for a long time without moving. I had a cup of coffee that went cold. I watched a red-tailed hawk sit on the fence post at the edge of my property for about 10 minutes before it decided I wasn't interesting and flew off. Then I picked up the phone and called Theodore. I told him everything Nathan had said. I asked him to document what he already had, the holding company, the Charlotte financing arrangement, the Columbia land acquisition, and to add to it everything Nathan had just outlined to me. I wanted a clean, organized file, the kind that could be handed to a lawyer and acted on immediately. Theodore said he'd have it by Tuesday. I also called a corporate attorney I've worked with for 20 years. His name is Whitman. He's in Atlanta. I told him I needed a consultation, and I needed it soon, and I needed it to cover both fiduciary duty and shareholder rights under South Carolina law. Whitman called back within the hour. We talked for 45 minutes. What I learned was this: as a shareholder of Caulfield Industrial, I had standing. If Nathan's activities constituted a breach of his fiduciary duty to the company, which they appeared to, quite clearly, then I had both the right and arguably the obligation to bring that information to the board. Moreover, if the Charlotte financing arrangement involved undisclosed conflicts of interest, there were potential securities issues that went beyond a civil dispute. I told Whitman to begin preparing a formal disclosure package. Not to file anything yet, just to prepare it. The following Thursday, I drove to Hilton Head. Bernard Caulfield was semi-retired and spent most of his time at the family property there. I hadn't called ahead. I drove up to the gate and gave my name to the groundskeeper, who recognized me from the wedding and let me through. Bernard met me on the back porch. He was in his late 60s, a broad man with a white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent a lot of time on the water. He seemed surprised, but not unwelcoming. He offered me sweet tea. I accepted. I told him I needed to show him something. I opened my briefcase and laid Theodore's file on the table between us. He read quietly for a long time. The only sound was the wind off the water and the creak of his chair. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at the horizon for a moment. Then he looked at me. "How long have you had this?" he asked. I told him about 3 weeks for the documented piece, and that the conversation with Nathan had happened the Friday before. He asked why I hadn't come sooner. I said I wanted to be certain. I also told him then about my equity position in his company. I told him the full story. When I'd invested, how much, why I hadn't disclosed it when our children married. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 9%. I said yes. He said, "You're my largest outside shareholder." I said I was aware. He looked at the file again. Then he looked at me. He said, "What do you want to happen here, Len?" I told him I didn't want anything except for him to have the information he needed to protect his company. I told him what he did with it was his decision. I told him I would support whatever process he chose to pursue, and that my attorney had already prepared documentation that could be submitted to legal counsel at his direction. He nodded slowly. He said he needed a day. I drove back to Augusta and waited. Bernard called me on Saturday morning. He had spoken with his own attorneys overnight. He had also spoken with 2 other members of the board. He asked me if I would be willing to provide a formal statement and make Theodore's documentation available to the company's legal team. I told him yes. What happened after that took about 6 weeks. I wasn't involved in the details. That was between Bernard, his lawyers, and whatever process they chose to follow. What I know is that Nathan was confronted with the documentation. A separation agreement was reached. The Columbia land parcel was unwound through a negotiated buyback at the original acquisition cost. No profit to Nathan. The Charlotte financing arrangement was disclosed, and Nathan repaid the undisclosed fee with interest. He was no longer employed by Caulfield Industrial. Ivy called me on a Wednesday night in December. She was crying, which broke something in me in the way only a daughter's tears can. She said she didn't understand how it had happened. She said she felt like she'd been living next to a stranger. I drove to Mount Pleasant the next morning. I sat with her for 2 days. I didn't tell her about my equity stake. Not then. That would have made it about me, and it wasn't about me. I just sat with her and let her work through it and told her the truth, which was that the man she married had made choices that couldn't be attributed to her and couldn't be fixed by her. She asked me how I'd found out. I told her I'd been paying attention. She said, "You knew, didn't you? You knew something was off." I said that I'd had questions and that I'd done what I could to get answers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" It's the question I've thought about more than any other. I still don't have a perfect answer. The one I gave her was the honest one. Because I wasn't certain, and because certainty matters when you're about to change someone's life. I didn't want to take something from her based on suspicion. I wanted to be right. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. The divorce was finalized the following spring. It was not contested. Ivy kept the house, which Nathan had signed over as part of their separation. She took her time, put it on the market 8 months later, and moved to Asheville, where she had friends and work she put on hold for too long. The last time I saw Nathan was at a gas station outside Columbia, about a year after everything had concluded. He pulled up next to my truck. He saw me. I saw him. He filled his tank and drove away without speaking. I don't know what he's doing now. I don't ask. Bernard and I have stayed in touch. We have lunch when I'm in the coastal area. He is a decent man who made the mistake that a lot of decent men make. He assumed that love and loyalty were the same thing and that one guaranteed the other. They don't. You have to verify. I still hold my position in Caulfield Industrial. The company's doing well. There's a new vice president of operations who came up through the logistics side of the business. Someone who actually knows the work. Bernard seems lighter than he did a few years ago. At our last lunch, he ordered dessert, which he told me he never used to do. Small things tell you a lot about people. My daughter is happy. That's the only part of this that matters to me in any lasting way. She called me last month from Asheville to tell me she'd been promoted, and that she was thinking about getting a dog. She asked me which breed I thought was best for someone who works from home. I told her a good dog is one that's loyal without being asked. She laughed and said that was the most me thing I'd ever said. Maybe so. I built what I built over 30 years by being patient, by watching and by understanding that most people show you exactly who they are, if you give them enough time and enough rope. The rope part isn't cruelty. It's just honesty. You can't save people from themselves before they've done anything wrong. You can only be ready when they do. Margaret, my late wife, used to say that I was the only person she knew who could sit in a quiet room and somehow be more productive than anyone else in a loud one. I thought about that a lot during those weeks. During the calls with Theodore, the drive to Hilton Head, the 2 days I sat with my daughter while she cried. Sitting still is its own kind of work. Most people never learn that. What we built is ours. What was taken was returned. And what I gave my daughter, not the equity, not the legal documentation, not the outcome, but the thing that actually cost me something, was the willingness to wait until I was certain and then to act without hesitation once I was. That's the only inheritance that matters. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and let me know. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And come back. There are more stories where this one came from, about the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who built something real and didn't let it go. I've been thinking lately about what Nathan actually saw when he looked at me that first time. A man in a flannel shirt with grease under his fingernails. A truck with a dent I never fixed. A father-in-law who didn't belong in the same room as the Caulfield name. He made his assessment and he moved on, and I think that assessment is what eventually undid him. Not me, not Bernard. His own certainty that he already knew what he was looking at. That's the thing about underestimating people. It doesn't just make you wrong, it makes you careless. And carelessness, in my experience, is where most people's real problems begin. I don't take any pleasure in the way this ended. I want to be honest about that. Nathan lost his career, his marriage, and a future that could have been decent if he'd just been willing to earn it. That's not a small thing. When I sat with Ivy those 2 days in December and watched her try to put herself back together, I wasn't feeling vindicated. I was feeling the weight of it. The weight of what dishonesty costs everyone in its orbit, not just the person doing it. But here's what I've come to understand over 63 years. The consequences Nathan faced weren't something I did to him. They were the accumulated result of choices he made, one after another, over a long period of time. The Columbia land deal. The Charlotte financing arrangement. The afternoon he sat at my kitchen table and asked me to help him squeeze his own father's company. Each one of those was a decision. Each one of those was him choosing a version of himself. By the time I drove to Hilton Head and laid that file on Bernard's table, Nathan had already written the ending. I just made sure it was legible. Integrity isn't complicated, but it is demanding. It asks you to do the right thing even when no one is watching, even when the wrong thing is profitable, even when you're reasonably certain you won't get caught. Nathan was smart enough to build a complicated structure. He just wasn't wise enough to understand that smart and wise are two different things, and that the distance between them is exactly where character lives. Resilience is the part of this story I think about most when it comes to Ivy. She could have collapsed into bitterness. She had every right to. Instead, she sold the house, moved to Asheville, went back to work she put on hold for years, and started rebuilding. She didn't ask for my approval or my advice. She just got up and moved forward, which is the only direction that actually leads anywhere. I am proud of her in a way I don't have the right words for. What I want anyone to take from this, if there's something to take, is not that patience is a strategy or that quiet people are dangerous. It's simpler than that. It's that how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you or to you is the most accurate measure of who you actually are. Nathan treated me like furniture. He treated his father's company like a resource to be extracted. He treated his marriage like a vehicle. The structures we build on those foundations don't stand. Build carefully. Verify what matters. And when the time comes to act, act without hesitation and without cruelty. Just clearly and completely and with the full weight of what you know behind you. That's all I've got.